Joe sighed to himself quietly, looking out of the window at the still, silent stretch of highway snaking through the desert, only to disappear somewhere over the horizon. The sun was slowly crawling down, almost completely vanished from sight, and he knew when it was gone, there'd be no light left in the desert. It wasn't the same kind of darkness you found in a city. There they had streetlights and cars whizzing through with their headlights on full blast. It never really got dark in the cities, but out here, nothing but true pitch-black darkness for miles around, only alleviated when the sky was clear enough for the stars to shine through, or broken by the beams of a passing car speeding down the highway. Giving another sigh, Joe sipped on his coffee. By this point, it was lukewarm to match the dropping temperature outside and bitter to the taste. But he needed the caffeine to keep himself awake. After all, he had a long night ahead of him, but then again, they were all long nights in this line of work. This was the only diner for miles around, and he had no idea just how many hours it would be before he next got to eat or drink anything. With an almost empty pot with the last dregs of coffee in one hand, the waitress came up to Joe at his table. It was the last spot in the diner with anyone still sitting in it. "Closing time," she told him with a tired smile. "One for the road?" Nodding, Joe lifted his travel mug for her to fill. As her workday was ending, his was about to start. He grabbed his jacket and slung it over his shoulder, leaving a few dollars as a tip on the table before he made his way out of the diner and over to his car. Buckling into the driver's seat, Joe took a deep breath as he pulled his phone out of his pocket, dreading the potential barrage of notifications that would come flooding through the second he did. Opening up the corresponding app, he clocked in for the night, and sure enough, was instantly met with a veritable tidal wave of requests. Grumbling quietly to himself, he tapped accept on the first one he saw and turned the key in the ignition. Working as a driver for a carpool and ride-sharing service was far from a simple job at the best of times, but even more so in this particular area of the southwestern United States. The state of New Mexico shared a border not only with Texas, but with Chihuahua, one of the northernmost states of Mexico. Being so close to the border meant that most of the calls and requests for lifts that Joe received on an average night meant he needed to bounce back and forth between the US and Mexico, crossing the border at his client's request. Legally, of course. We're not going all Breaking Bad here today. Some nights weren't so complicated. Someone might just need a quick ride from Dona Ana to the town of Truth or Consequences, a New Mexico town named after, we kid you not, a TV game show. Sure, that might have been a 75-mile drive up the I-25, but at least it didn't involve crossing from El Paso into the city of Juarez. At this time of night, it was nowhere near as busy as during the day, but even so, that didn't make hopping back and forth over the border and all the red tape it entailed any less of an arduous process, especially stuck behind the wheel of a car for hours on end. Tonight, however, wasn't a simple night. Joe's first call was for a pickup from a couple whose flight had been rerouted to the international airport in Juarez. They seemed to be newlyweds and demanded to be taken all the way back to a hotel in Las Cruces, making it abundantly clear that they didn't want to stay closer to the airport and outright refusing when Joe offered to recommend them some nearby hotels. Getting to know most of the area around the three-way intersection between New Mexico, Texas, and the Mexican border after driving around it so many times, he'd gotten to know the area pretty well. Unfortunately, not everyone wanted to hear a display of Joe's local knowledge. Most of them just wanted him to drive them in silence. Next up, a group of rowdy guys, real frat house types from the University of El Paso, Texas. They wanted to be taken to a bar halfway across the city. A bit more of a straightforward trip, Joe thought, although he could have done without them drunkenly chanting spring break at the top of their lungs every 5 minutes. After that, it was another jaunt across the border, this time transporting a suit and Stetson-wearing Texas gentleman to Horizon City. He spent the whole ride on his phone, talking at length about a business deal he'd just closed, not saying a word to Joe the entire time. Doug Dimmadome, eat your heart out. The next person to request a lift wasn't much more talkative either. She was a 20-something girl who plainly stated she just wanted to get far away from Sierra Blanca. Hours and hours had ticked by since Joe had left the diner. The last of the coffee in his travel mug had been finished long before. His next ride request had come through and required him to once again make the drive out to the other side of the border. By this point, the evening had turned into night, and was now approaching the earliest hours of the following morning. The desert still filled with nothing but deep, inky blackness. The same desert that had scorched acres upon acres of skin, that had taken so many lives, big and small, and had picked the skin and flesh from countless bones. The desert can be a truly merciless place at the best of times, but sometimes there's a little something more out there, just waiting for you, dark and hungry. Occasionally, as he drove back towards El Paso, Joe would see another car speeding towards him on the other side of the highway, but it was so dark that he could see nothing of the driver. Only their headlights were visible, right up until they drove past him. Everything behind the hood of the oncoming car almost imperceptible as it whizzed through the night. Crossing the border so many times a night, Joe had become friendly with a few of the officers that patrolled the gates, waving cars past after they'd shown the necessary paperwork. He was never usually held there for long enough to start actual conversations with them, exchanging only a friendly nod or one-liner with the few Border Patrol guards whose names he could still remember. But sometimes when things were a little quieter at the gates, he'd overhear the odd passing comment while his driver's side window was rolled down. Tonight, as the long barrier in front of his car was raised, Joe caught a few words coming through on a radio belonging to one of the guards, something vague about sightings of phantom lights. He chuckled to himself, writing it off as yet another alleged alien sighting. Something about the desert at night really seemed to capture people's imaginations, Joe thought to himself, as he pulled away from the border gate, heading for the I-10. There were always stories like that circulating around this area of New Mexico. It was easy to see why, being so close to Roswell, New Mexico, the home of alien sightings, and just a couple hundred miles away from the true alien mecca, Area 51, a United States Air Force base that secretly housed alien life forms and spaceships, allegedly at least, if years of conspiracy believers and Facebook memers are to be believed. Every so often, one of Joe's passengers would ask him about unidentified flying objects, or he'd overhear them talking amongst themselves about a slew of urban legends, phantom hitchhikers that would hitch rides on the highway, only to vanish from the back seats of cars, and of course, tales of disembodied floating lights, either hovering way up in the sky or just above the ground. Regardless of whichever one was popular at any given moment, Joe knew there were plenty of weird and spooky stories coming out of the desert. What he was unaware of, however, was that he was currently in one of his own. He'd been so wrapped up in thoughts of what he might do if one of the people that hired him turned out to be a wandering spirit that Joe didn't even notice he had made a wrong turn. It was only by the virtue of glancing at his car's GPS that he even realized, and by then, it had been long enough since that he was completely unsure how far back it was that he had made such an error. According to the map, he was nowhere. He hadn't stopped. His car was still moving at a steady speed down the long stretch of asphalt, but the GPS didn't show any road at his current location. He had no clue which part of which highway he was even on. Short on options and short on time to get to his next client for the night, Joe just did what his job required of him. He kept on driving. Anyone watching from a distance would have seen an empty, lengthy portion of highway with but one single car traveling along it, only the headlights both illuminating the road in front of it and giving away the car's position. Slowing down slightly just to play it safe, Joe tried searching up where he was using the Maps app on his phone. He figured he wouldn't get stopped for checking his phone while driving, or be much risk to any other drivers on the road. After all, it seemed like his was the only car around for miles. Even if he was still heading in near enough the right direction for his next pickup, that would be at least some saving grace. Maybe the map on the car's built-in GPS was a little outdated, he thought, and that was preventing this part of the highway from showing up. Connection to the internet was extremely limited this far out in the New Mexico desert, and by the time the map loaded, it didn't provide much in the way of new information or even the slightest bit of comforting reassurance. It only seemed to agree with the GPS that Joe was well and truly lost. As he took his free hand off the wheel for a split second, just to try and zoom in on the satellite view of the terrain, two bright white lights appeared in the distance. Startled, Joe dropped his phone into the front passenger seat, hearing it slip onto the floor of the car as he gripped the steering wheel again, both hands back to 10 and 2. The lights were speeding in the opposite direction he was driving in, a fair few feet ahead of him, but still, it was another vehicle on this otherwise empty, isolated stretch of the highway. A loud and sudden idea rang out in Joe's head. If he could signal what he had assumed to be another approaching car, He could ask the driver where exactly he was and what the quickest route to get back to the I-10 was. He couldn't guarantee he would make the oncoming vehicle stop and help him after all. So few people would willingly trust a stranger on the highway, but considering his only other options were to either keep driving along this seemingly endless road or to turn back around and try to find wherever it was he'd made the wrong turn in the first place, needless to say, Joe's hands were a little tied. Tapping the appropriate switch affixed to his wheel, he flicked on his own headlights on and off in an effort to catch the other driver's attention. Nothing. The pair of headlights kept their current course, both theirs and Joe's traveling parallel to each other, as if they were about to joust with their beams of light. Hitting the switch again, Joe tried lowering his headlight setting and then raising them back to full brightness. Still nothing from the other driver. He pushed the emergency button that activated both the front and rear lights of the car, but this one only yielded the same result. Deciding there was nothing else that he could do, Joe gently pulled his vehicle over, parking abruptly at this side of the highway. He instinctively checked his rear view, only to remember that there wasn't anyone behind him, just him and the apparently oblivious driver approaching ahead. In a last-ditch effort to get their attention, Joe punched the car horn, rolling down his window in order to listen for a response. The blaring noise echoed through the empty desert night, a loud and sustained blast followed by a beat of silence as Joe paused, waiting to hear the same sound back from the oncoming vehicle. He squinted at it through the dark. It was still pretty far, but closing rapidly, or as far as he could tell it was. All he had to go on was the advancing lights, with nothing visible behind them. Joe leaned out of his window, hoping that it would somehow give him better visibility through the sheer darkness of a desert at night. It did as little to improve things as a second, much longer blast of his horn did. The other driver still didn't react. By now, the lights were close enough that whoever was behind the other wheel would be able to see Joe. And yet, they didn't do anything to change their speed, didn't flicker their lights back or sound their own horn. Nothing. Just the same 2 points of light. They might as well have been floating just above the ground, given how they obscured what was behind them. At this point, Joe was certain they were close enough to see him now, little more than a few feet in front of his stationary car and still closing at a sustained speed. Getting agitated, he went to hit his horn a third time when he noticed something, or rather, he noticed something that he hadn't. This car hurtling towards him through the night wasn't making any sound. It wasn't just that the other driver deliberately hadn't returned the signals Joe had been trying to give. There was no noise coming from it whatsoever. No grumbling of an engine, nor the rolling of rubber tires against the asphalt surface of the highway. It was silent, just the pair of ominous lights soundlessly racing through the night, heading straight for where Joe was sat, parked still, a sitting duck like he was defenseless prey. Violently turning the key in the ignition, Joe slammed his foot down on the accelerator. His car sputtered to life and careened down the road. He was headed straight for the other car, if it even was a car, hoping to shoot straight past it and take his chances continuing along the highway alone. The lights were almost on top of him now, still too bright to make out anything behind them, but there was still no engine noise, nothing to indicate what the hell it even was, until one of them jumped onto the hood of his car. An orb of light, attached to a thrashing shape beneath, parted from the other. It leaped through the air and came down right in the path of Joe's car, just as he was about to pass what he first thought to be another car. The light smashed directly through the windshield, Joe instinctively lifting an arm to cover his face and protect his eyes from the impending shower of broken glass. But it was in that second that he took his eyes off the road that the other light made its move. It had been perfectly parallel with Joe's car, only to turn sharply and violently, connecting with the driver's side door with enough force to not only dent the metal surface, but to completely lift the car up. It barreled sideways, tumbling over itself off the highway and into the surrounding desert. Trapped inside, buckled tight, Joe was thrown about in his seat, unable to steady himself as the car rolled. His arm was still over his face, splinters of glass showering over him. The whatever it was still thrashing about, its glow illuminating the entire interior of the car, until the whole vehicle came to a stop, landing upside down, wheels in the air pointing up at the cloudy night sky. Hanging the wrong way up, Joe reached for his seatbelt and unclasped it. His head instantly dropped onto the ceiling of the upturned car. Through the shattered driver's side window, he crawled out on his hands. The pain was shooting through his whole body, bruises and blood covering his arms, an intense, agonizing feeling of broken bones on top of that. Rolling over onto his back, Joe looked up at the wreck of his car, his livelihood, and the monster standing in front of it. Illuminated fully for the first time by the car's still active headlights, the thing had managed to pull itself free from the destroyed windshield and was now pacing slowly around the overturned hood. It walked on two legs, but it didn't move like a man. In fact, it didn't even look like one. It was like something pulled straight out of prehistoric times. A pair of hinged limbs supporting a streamlined reptilian body with hooked claws on its feet. Its back was arched, keeping itself low as its two arms stayed close to its center. The creature had almost human-like hands, but each finger was tipped with long, pointed talons. But its head was what Joe saw first, what he had seen at a distance and mistaken for car headlights only a few minutes ago. In the place he wouldn't have expected to see a pair of slitted eyes staring at him was a bulbous mass of a head. Bioluminescent light glowed from beneath the monster's skin, a brain visible amongst a web of bright organs, and beneath that, a wide, gaping maw of sharp teeth. Joe noticed another light drawing near, brightening the area where he lay defenseless. The second of the raptor-like monsters was pacing closer to him, both their glowing heads kept low to the ground, ready to strike. "Yep, looks pretty clear to me," one of the men disguised as a highway patrol officer announced. "Handprints match up with what their front paws look like. No trace of the driver. Just a big wreck in the middle of nowhere." Better get on the horn to control then," his colleague replied, wearing a similar uniform. "I thought SCP-745s were only found a little north of here." We shut off the section of the highway they usually show up at," the First Foundation agent explained casually, sipping his coffee as he looked at the upturned wreckage of Joe's car. His body was nowhere to be found. "But every now and then, a couple of them will show up a bit away from there. One of them wouldn't come this far into the south of New Mexico on its own, though." Because of the lights, right?" his fellow agent responded, the two of them walking back towards the car. Their heads. They mimic car headlights or something." "Well, there's that." The first man nodded, taking one last look at the long, open desert around them and the highway stretching through it. "Plus, it must get lonely traveling out here on your own." Now go and check out SCP-1265, the Mesozoic Preserve, and SCP-682, Terrifying Test Logs, to continue on a Jurassic journey filled with more rampaging reptilian creatures and other ravenous raptor-like anomalies.